And now, please welcome tonight's speaker, Jen Ellert. Jen has a bachelor's degree in plant science and sustainable agriculture from Cornell University and a master's of landscape architecture from North Carolina State University. She's worked on merging ecological and aesthetic principles in site design for 16 years, including commercial and public projects at CLH Design in Raleigh, North Carolina, as well as stormwater-focused residential and commercial design in North Carolina and Minnesota. Jen leads the design team at Metro Bloom's Design and Build, ensuring that equity principles are incorporated throughout company culture and projects. She has a strong passion for this work, leading design on numerous affordable housing projects, ensuring that design processes and implementation center resident voice, values, and needs. Take it away, Jen.
Thanks, Deborah. I appreciate that nice introduction. And I'll go ahead and get started. Thanks, everyone. I'm here at our Metro Bloom's offices where all the magic happens. So thanks so much for having me tonight. I really appreciate your attendance, as well as the Minnesota State Horticultural Society for having me and for hosting this webinar. Well, as the name implies, tonight we're going to talk about Hell Strip gardening, also known as the boulevard. So that's one of the most challenging growing environments in our urban landscape, is really that space between your sidewalk and the street. And we'll talk a little bit tonight about how we can transform that space into something that's beautiful, that's creating habitat, that's really helping to prevent stormwater runoff. And we're also going to talk a little bit about kind of the why that's necessary and why that's really helpful in our urban environment right now. First, make sure this is working. There we go. I want to tell you a little bit about who we are. So I work for Metro Bloom's. We're a nonprofit organization that has been around for about 30 years. We originally started with a garden awards program, but our focus has shifted over the past several years, really towards partnering with communities to create resilient landscapes. Our focus is really on landscapes as they relate to clean water and watersheds, and we center equity and inclusion in a lot of the work that we do. We also manage the Blue Thumb Partnership. Blue Thumb is really a kind of a consortium of cities, contractors, and other partners who are focused on clean water within the landscape. They're all promoting resilient landscape practices, and we really manage that, that partnership. All right, I want to start as I talk about boulevards and the importance of why we might want to change the way we practice landscaping in boulevards by talking to you about conservation challenges, really kind of the why behind we do the work that we do and behind why we're focused on boulevards within this presentation. A lot of you probably know this already, but it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of a reminder. It's important when we think about the type of habitat that we're creating to understand kind of the conservation challenges that are facing us as it relates to habitat loss. So this map shows us where the historic prairie coverage was before 1900. That's all the areas that you see here in yellow. And then we really have in red kind of the current prairie coverage, and this map was created as of 2012. And you can see how much of that historic prairie within Minnesota has been reduced from its original rain to some smaller areas that are really focused along, usually along waterways and along some preserved natural areas. As we zoom in a little bit more, I want to show you the 7-county metro area, and that's that plan on the top right there. And we can start to see the remaining native plant communities within that area. And so how you can see again how if you consider previously an undeveloped area, how these remaining areas in purple are the remaining native plant communities. They're really focused around some of our existing rivers, lakes, and other preserved natural areas. This is a result of changes to how we use our landscapes. So of course, agriculture, which is necessary for our well-being, but it does reduce biodiversity within the landscape. Housing, urban environments, all of these things have shifted the way that our landscape has been formed, and it shifts the way that the types of plants that grow in our landscapes. If we zoom in a little bit more, and this is a really relevant time to be talking about this, we can look at what we're applying to the surfaces of our landscape in an urban area. And this is a especially pertinent time of year to talk about salt. So you can really start to see as you walk around, and we're in that thick of the freeze-thaw cycle, all of the salt that is applied to our streets, our sidewalks, our driveways. It's important to help us prevent slip and fall accidents, but it also could be applied a lot more judiciously. And there's some great resources out there if you aren't familiar about smart salting and ways to really reduce the amount of salt and to use it in a way that makes sure that it's essentially very effective in its use. One of the kind of facts that I like to really let people know of, it's a bit shocking, is that 1 teaspoon of salt will permanently contaminate 5 gallons of water. So when you start to think about our natural water resources and how salt may be impacting them, we all love to fish, we love to swim, we love to boat, and it really is helpful for us to start thinking about how we can reduce our salt usage. The reason this is so important is because as our landscapes have shifted from being mostly pervious surfaces, which are plants, lawn, trees, shrubs, and perennials, to impervious surfaces, the way that our landscapes shed water has changed. And so when we have a very natural landscapes, most of the water, as you can see in the picture on the left, we have a little bit of surface runoff, so the smaller arrow there, and then we have a lot of subsurface water flow. So rain will soak into the soil, and it's really going to flow through the soil as opposed to on the top of the surface of the soil. If you look on the right, when we have a more urban environment, we have much more impervious surface. So when we have a rain event, we have the water as it rains really falls on our impervious surfaces like roofs and sidewalks and driveways. And then it's going to flow over the surface a lot more than the subsurface flow. So we have a bigger arrow there on the image on the right showing you the surface flow. So when it rains, it really flows over that surface. And it picks up a bunch of stuff as it goes along. That can be salt that we just looked at a picture of. That can be trash, can be pet waste or fertilizer. And then that begins to enter our water bodies. And so one of the reasons I'm telling you a lot about this is because we have a real opportunity with Boulevard Rain Gardens to start to intercept some of this surface runoff. Before we get there, one of the things I want to let you know of is that more than 56% of Minnesota water bodies don't meet water quality standards for aquatic life and human health. That means that they're classified as impaired water bodies by the MPCA, or Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Excuse me. An average property can produce something like 40,000 gallons of runoff every year. So you can start to see how all that surface runoff, since it's no longer soaking into the soil, can really impact nearby water bodies. I have a little animation here to show you how that works. So of course, rain's going to fall on your roof and it's not going to soak in, hopefully not soak into your roof, down your downspout, into the street, and then right into the storm drain. As it heads into the storm drain, it picks up this stuff with it, and our technical term for that is gunk. So it picks up that gunk and sends that gunk right down into the storm drain and into our nearest water body. That's really causing quite a bit of algae blooms, that kind of smell that doesn't smell very good, and because all of that gunk has an excess of nutrients in it, and those excess of nutrients cause the algae blooms in our water bodies. This is Powderhorn Lake here in Minneapolis from several years ago as an example. So as we're starting to talk about Boulevard Rain Gardens and we get into this topic a little bit more, I would really encourage you to think about how stormwater moves through your landscape specifically. I cannot recommend enough putting on a raincoat, going outside during a rainstorm, and when it's safe, when there's no lightning, but really watching how water is running across your sidewalks, your front yard, your backyard, so you can see where you might have opportunities to capture that water in something like a rain garden. And a rain garden is going to help that infiltrate into the soil. I'm going to get to Boulevard Rain Gardens, but first I want to make sure you all have an understanding of what a rain garden is in general. This is an example of if we took a slice right through a rain garden, what that might look like. Especially on a residential scale or in a boulevard, it's not a very high-tech issue. It's a very low-tech solution to the problem, which means it's easy for all of us to implement something like a rain garden. A rain garden is essentially a lowered perennial planting. It's selected with plants that are going to do well if they get really wet if it rains, or if they get really dry if it doesn't rain. The goal of a rain garden is to have a flat bottom. That flat bottom allows for water to infiltrate into the soil across that entire bottom of the rain garden. Most residential rain gardens that I designed, for example, that are catching water from a downspout or a couple of downspouts are only 6 inches deep. So this is not a big hole in your yard. It's very minimal and can be very easy to implement. So water comes in at some point, comes in either from a sidewalk or a downspout, that's your inlet. And then you always want to make sure a rain garden has a place to overflow. We know that rain events are changing in Minnesota, and we are getting kind of heavy rains that maybe rains less frequently, but when it does, it really rains hard. So we want to make sure that we're also protecting our basements and our property. And so we always want to know that the rain garden can overflow if it gets really, really full of water. You do not necessarily have to remove the soil and bring in a different type of soil or sand. You can oftentimes infiltrate through the existing soil. And there are some ways to do infiltration tests, kind of to see how fast your soil infiltrates water before you do a rain garden. So just a quick primer on rain gardens, because I really want to talk to you about boulevard rain gardens. That's what we're all here for. This is a great example to show you a little bit about a typical urban boulevard and how we can start to rethink the shape of those boulevards. It's pretty subtle, but can have a really big difference. So in the pictures on the right, you can see our typical urban boulevard profile. That's where you have a mounded boulevard. Oftentimes it has lawn in it. That's fairly typical. And it's really designed to shed water. So you can see that water is going to flow off of it into the street. Or if there's water on the sidewalk, it's really not going to flow into the boulevard because that lawn or turf is preventing it from getting into this soil area. You can lower the turf in a boulevard to help water get into the boulevard. That's this middle picture on the right. So that by lowering the turf really helps the runoff leave the sidewalk and get into the boulevard. Or you can do something like a boulevard rain garden or bioswale. They're very interchangeable terms, rain garden or bioswale in this case. You might hear me say both of them here tonight. So the rain garden on the bottom right is really planted with native plants, and it's providing an opportunity not only to capture runoff because it now allows water to get into the boulevard, but it's also providing habitat. So we're going to talk through kind of some of the ins and outs of how to create these boulevard rain gardens or bioswales. Now that we've talked a bit about the challenges of conservation and really promoting native habitat in our area, you can start to see these spaces, which had previously been fairly neglected, as real opportunities for both runoff capture and for creating native plant habitat. As I start to talk to you about boulevards, I want to highlight one project that Metro Blooms has been working on for several years, and that is a project where we are working with the City of Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Park Board to implement our boulevard bioswales in areas where they are removing ash trees. I'm sure you all are very familiar with the challenges that ash trees are facing with emerald ash borer. And the City of Minneapolis has been systematically removing those ash trees over the course of the past several years. There are approximately 38,000 ash trees that will be removed by the end of this, and it's very expensive to obviously remove those trees. So this is just another reason for us to start creating additional diversity in our landscape, because it makes us more resilient to attacks from invasive species. That's a whole nother topic we could go into. But this is a great example of some of the typical boulevard profiles that we're working with. So these are areas where there may be mounded turf. You can see that the grass or any existing mulch would block the flow of runoff. There may be existing trees in the boulevard. And one of the things that we really focus on is the value of trees. So we're trying to really target boulevards where we know an ash tree needs to be removed. I don't want you all to think that you should go out there and remove a tree just so you can create a boulevard bioswale. Trees have an incredible ecological benefit to our area in general, and so they soak up a lot of runoff. And if you have a really healthy boulevard tree, that's great, and you should treat it well and don't put in a boulevard bioswale there. But if you have an empty boulevard, or you know you're removing a tree like an ash tree, then that's a good opportunity to potentially install a boulevard rain garden. So we have a lot going on in a boulevard. There's also utilities located in a boulevard, and that's something we often have to deal with as well. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Before I get into those details, I want to show a picture of just where some of these ash trees have been within the city of Minneapolis, and this is an image of kind of the North Minneapolis area. North Minneapolis has a long history of environmental injustice, and so our work on boulevard bioswales is actually very much focused in the North Minneapolis area. We are working with the park board to not only take down those ash trees, but then to replace them, because this area has, there are more ash trees within North Minneapolis than there are in many other areas. They're really focused, so they are almost disproportionately being impacted by the emerald ash borer and the removal of ash trees. That removes shade, it removes all the ecosystem services that these mature trees provide. And so we're really working with leaders in the neighborhood and residents to engage them in not only the design and installation of these boulevard bioswales, but then also in the care of the boulevard rain gardens over time. Just an example of what we accomplished in 2019 with our boulevard bioswales. We worked on over 6,000 square feet of boulevard rain gardens that we installed. We've got some fun pictures here. That encompassed 37 boulevard rain gardens. There were different units. We measured them in 120 square foot units. We did at least 50 of those. That captures approximately 233 pounds of sediment, 283,569 gallons of runoff each year, and 1.12 pounds of phosphorus. Phosphorus is really what once it gets into our waters, that's really what causes so many of the algae blooms. So it's important to be able to capture that runoff. So you can kind of see from our engagement work on the left to planting the boulevards to a kind of close-up of a boulevard right after planting to even the following year on the very right, what those boulevards start to look like. We, of course, like everyone else, ran into challenges during the pandemic, and this year are doing really well set up to be able to do quite a few boulevard installations this year. So we're excited about that. Some things for you to consider when you are thinking about your boulevards and how you're going to move forward with this project, or should you put in a boulevard bioswale. Anytime you're putting in a rain garden or something that's going to really soak water into the soil, you want to stay 10 feet away from a basement, or equidistant away from how deep the structure is below the surface of the soil. Most boulevards are not 10 feet within 10 feet of a basement, but I want to make sure I put that up there just to make you aware of that. You want to make sure that you can capture runoff safely, that it's going to be able to infiltrate and then have a safe way of overflowing should it really get quite full. And as I mentioned earlier, let's talk about existing trees that are valuable. So you have something like an oak, a maple, a honey locust that's doing really well, a linden. That tree is already providing a ton of ecosystem services, so you don't necessarily need to start digging into that tree and digging into its roots to put in a bioswale. Treat it kindly and give it some space. You don't want to dig within the drip line of the existing tree if it's healthy and you're going to keep it. The other thing to consider are local ordinances. This is really important. All throughout the state, there are ordinances that are going to apply to the height of everything from the height of plants within a boulevard to whether you can excavate in a boulevard. So it's really important that you check your local ordinances before you start to implement a boulevard rain garden in your own boulevard. And then, of course, it's actually legally required for you to have your underground utilities located. You can always call Gopher State One Call, call 811, register to have your utilities located. They will not mark private utilities. There really shouldn't be any private utilities in your boulevard, but if for some reason you installed irrigation or dog fencing in your boulevard, that's obviously not going to get marked by Gopher State One Call. So you really want to have those utilities marked. Most utilities are quite deep, and when you have a simple 3 to 6 inch deep rain garden in a boulevard, you're not likely to run into those utilities. However, the one that is the most challenging is like a fiber optic utility. Those often can be quite shallow. So that's why you always want to have utilities marked so you know what you're working with. All right. Let's talk about some of the steps to creating a boulevard bioswale. It's not easy, and it's not called a health strip for nothing. It can be really compacted soil. So the first thing we want to do is remove the turf. There are lots of ways to remove turf. We are doing this generally pretty quickly, and we're either using with our crews and in a setting where we are installing projects, we're either using equipment or a sod kicker. As you can see here, we do sometimes work with the Conservation Corps, and they feature a lot in our photos. I want to give them a shout out for all their hard work. And then you need to find a way to excavate that soil. You would be really surprised how much soil comes out of a boulevard when you're only taking 3 inches of soil out. It sort of decompacts and fluffs up, and it can be quite a bit of soil. So you really want to have a plan for what you're going to do with that soil. Can you use it somewhere else on your property? Are you going to haul it away to a soil recycling facility? Make sure you think about that before you start. And if you're going to take a couple of days to install your boulevard, and this is something you're going to do yourself, keep your sidewalk and street clear of sediment. You want to make sure you sweep them every day, because if you get a rain event, you don't want all that loose soil to then go right into the storm drain and to contribute to poor water quality. Now, you can see it can be exhausting. This is one of our crew members here. You can see it's can be very compacted. We even had a piece of equipment, but this is just a great example of why we might start to call this health strip gardening, just because of the challenges that are faced in compacted soil in our boulevards and in an area where soil has not been really treated well for a long period of time. So this is a boulevard that was transitioned. You can see in the picture on the left what it looked like before and compared to the picture on the right. And one of the things I want you to notice in the picture on the left is this area that I've highlighted right here in red. So it's kind of like a telltale sign for me when I'm going out to a property to see where water might be able to get into the boulevard but be blocked. And you can see there's kind of sediment, a little bit of sand on the sidewalk, and that's something for you to look at. So when you're going out to evaluate whether you could put in a boulevard bioswale and how does water move across your sidewalk, start to look for areas like that. What's happening there is when it rains, water runs all down that sidewalk, but it can't move kind of to the left and into that lawn area because the grass is really blocking that water from getting off of the sidewalk and into that lawn. And so when you look at the picture on the right, you can see how much lower the soil profile is. And we've just watered all these plants in here. Those are those wet patches on the sidewalk. But any rain that falls on that sidewalk now can go over the lip of that sidewalk and right into that planted area where it can be captured and infiltrated before it goes right into that storm drain in the street. So that's really providing kind of like a little spot to capture, infiltrate. If it gets really full, it will overflow. But for most of the rain events, it can capture quite a bit of runoff and infiltrate it before it gets into the storm drain. And that's the whole goal of creating a boulevard rain garden. Look at my time, looking good. So just some of the steps to creating a boulevard rain garden. You really want to make sure that at least for your initial planting that you do use some type of mulch for moisture retention and weed suppression. These are areas where there often a high weed presence. It's not uncommon for there to be weeds that have been spreading seeds within that soil for a long time, and you want to give your native plants and your new plantings, and we'll talk more about plants. Don't worry about that. I've got a few slides about plants. But you just want to give them every opportunity to get a really good start. And one other way that you can do that is to water for longer, less frequently. You want the water within the soil to go deep into the soil profile, so you really train the roots of these plants to go deep into the soil. You know, one of the reasons we focus a lot on native plants at Metro Blooms is because of their deep root systems, and I'm sure you all are very well aware of this. But those deep root systems really create channels for all this runoff to get that much deeper into the soil. So the native plants, and we'll talk about the plants that we really like to plant in boulevards, are excellent at helping that runoff infiltrate deeper into the profile of the soil. The other thing I really, really recommend is a really dense planting. Anytime you have bare areas of mulch, they're an invitation for weeds to come enjoy this nice, moist environment. But if you plant densely, you're really giving your new plants a kind of a jump start. You want them to fill in before weeds have a chance to take over. And so a dense planting is really key to the success of a boulevard rain garden, especially in an area that has been really traditionally fairly neglected. So this is, maybe a month or so after planting. I liked this picture because it showed the difference in the height of the soil in the boulevard, and that's key to starting your boulevard rain garden. So now any water on that sidewalk coming from that slope on the right as it comes down across the sidewalk, it can get into this planting and be soaked into the soil. If there was a mounded lawn area there, it wouldn't be able to even get into that kind of impervious space. And then this one is a great slide to help illustrate how you can think about water flows across your property. And this one's obviously been in for a couple of years here. So I want you to notice on the right of this picture, the downspouts from the house. And so they actually had installed some rock swales. So their downspouts were coming out of their house kind of a little steep, and they wanted to slow that water down. And then it comes from both of those downspouts and flows right across the sidewalk and now gets captured into this rain garden. So it's a great opportunity to think about where you can potentially capture the runoff from your house and from your roof in this kind of area before it goes right into the curb and gutter and right into the storm drain. This is a great example of a dense planting. So I really wanted to show you this so you could start to think about how densely you can plant boulevards and how they can start to really fill in so that we're not creating any space for those weeds to take over within that boulevard. And then really briefly, I want to talk to you a little bit about boulevard rain gardens, kind of on a bigger scale, just for a couple of slides here. This is pictures of rain gardens really as green infrastructure. So not just within a boulevard, but here within the city of Minneapolis in what's called a traffic diverter. So where you have two streets, there would normally be an intersection, but those streets now just curve. And we worked with the city of Minneapolis on this project, as well as a neighborhood association, in order to be able to utilize that space to capture and soak in runoff. And you can start to see what a beautiful garden that can become. I love this aerial photograph of this garden. So on the very left is our storm drain. And so runoff from the street flows right into that storm drain. And now the sump underneath that storm drain has been modified. So there's actually a pipe that brings that runoff underneath the sidewalk and into this lowered planting in this traffic diverter right here. This is much deeper than a typical boulevard rain garden, but it's capturing a lot more runoff. This is capturing street runoff, not just sidewalk runoff. So as you start to think about, how we can use the kind of small spaces within our urban landscapes to become really amazing areas of habitat, of flowers that we all enjoy, as well as providing kind of green infrastructure to help that stormwater runoff soak into the soil instead of flowing right down a pipe into the Mississippi River. This is a great example of that type of project, and you can start to support those or learn more about them as you walk around. Okay, the part that we all like to talk about. Let's talk a little bit about plants, and specifically the ones that we find do well in boulevards. We have several boulevard pallets that we use in our projects where we are installing lots and lots of boulevards. And this is the first one. It's also the least expensive to install because it's a seeded plant pallet. This is really a bee-lawn plant palette. It includes creeping thyme, Dutch white clover, and a low or no-mow fescue mix, depends on whether you want to mow or not, as well as self-heal, which is a really strong plant. And so there are some challenges to this plant palette. There can be some challenges to getting it established. This plant palette, to get it established, requires a different watering regimen than what I explained before. As with any type of seeded ground cover, you're wanting to water just a little bit to keep the seeds moist every day until they germinate, and then you can cut back on watering. And then just like any other plant palette, you have to really still weed up an area that might be seeded with a bee lawn seed. So for example, there was a lot of creeping Charlie previously present. You don't want that to take over again. It just takes a little longer for a plant palette like this to get established. You do need to make sure you keep up on weeds if you go with a seeded plant palette. But one of the benefits is that it's not a huge investment in terms of cost because the seed is less expensive than plants. This is our most popular plant palette when it comes to our neighborhood projects and our City of Minneapolis Boulevard projects. This is a plant palette that can really handle a sunny and dry condition. Now we know that boulevard rain gardens are going to fill up when it rains, but most of the time they're going to be dry, and we need to make sure that they are adapted to that type of growing condition. You can see here that we have really created a palette that has a range of plants that bloom all throughout the year, and so that's really key to protecting pollinators, is to have pollinator-friendly species that are going to bloom as early as possible through as late as possible. And in this case, we have the challenge of height, so we really need to stay as much as possible below 30 inches to meet the City of Minneapolis ordinance for plants within a boulevard. And then also just the challenging growing environment that a boulevard is, right? So it can be very, as I mentioned, full of weeds that could have compacted soil. And so we really want plants here that are going to fill in and create a matrix of plants. And so we tend to use grasses, and some of these palettes coming up, you'll see sedges to create that matrix. So in this case, both side oats grama and blue grama are our grasses that create kind of a matrix of dense grass plantings through which our forbs can come up and bloom. One of my favorites on this is really the Pearly Everlasting. It has a little bit of some salt tolerance, and that can be a benefit in the boulevards. Everyone loves to see butterfly milkweed and see that vibrant orange color when it's blooming. I also like prairie phlox for its early season bloom, and then we always want to try to have some asters, goldenrods, something that's really going to provide that vital nectar and pollen for bees later in the season as well. And just so you know, these plants palettes are included in the handout that's going to be emailed to you, so you don't have to frantically write this down. We'll be sending you a copy of a few of these palettes for you to enjoy. So as we start to move to kind of a part sun, part shade condition, it's actually pretty common in an urban environment where you might have a building or something that creates a very straight line of shade right across an otherwise sunny area. Or you have a planting that's going to get full sun in the morning, but then shade in the afternoon, kind of those urban areas where your sun and shade may seem to be at odds with each other. This is a great palette for that. And one of the things that I love about this plant palette is I really love sedges. I love how they green up early in the spring, provide that kind of really vital green color that we're all craving when we start to see plants coming out of the ground. And then they do a great job of having a strong root mass that can help hold that soil when there's a lot of water in the rain garden, and then having covering the ground with their fine foliage really covers the ground. So this is one of my favorite palettes that really balances an area that can get some sun, can get some shade, and then has plantings that continue all throughout that, that bloom all throughout the growing season. And as we start to move into a deeper shade palette, because there's some nearby trees, this is one that I would suggest. And again, these palettes are going to be sent to you, so you don't have to worry about writing all this down. We like to use pen sedge here as our main sedge within this larger matrix. So we've really transitioned from grasses, which prefer a little more sun, to sedges that can take some shade, and they provide kind of the foundation through which the flowers within this can come up. And so those grasses are what's going to anchor the soil, those sedges in this case is what's going to anchor the soil and really hold that soil and kind of help suppress weeds that might otherwise pop up. But this, and one thing I meant to mention with the early palette is this is an example of about 150 square feet of planting, and you can start to see just how many plants we're putting in that dense planted area. Just a few more slides to tell you about when you're thinking about plant selection. I would really say, especially for your boulevard, select your smaller plants. 4-inch containers or plugs are easy to plant. They're not too physically difficult to plant. They can be cost efficient. And make sure you lay out all the plants before you plant. You don't want to purchase what you're interested in planting and then end up planting it a little too close together, all bunched up in one corner. So by laying out plants out all before planting, you really get your even spacing across your boulevard. Make sure you just plant the plant at the same depth that it is in the container. Cut any, really root-bound plants up so that those roots don't just continue to circle, that they go deeper into the soil. And then if you have a situation where you have a downspout that's coming towards your boulevard rain garden, you can use some decorative river rock. It can be as beautiful or as utilitarian as you want to just help slow that water down a little bit. So this example of this kind of rock swale here at this downspout really helps to just kind of slow this flow of water so it doesn't rush into the rain garden, especially as it's getting established, and that way it doesn't blow all the mulch away. One thing that I meant to mention earlier, and I'll make sure I say it right now, is that the type of mulch that you use in a rain garden is really important. You want to make sure you use a double shredded hardwood mulch or some other shredded mulch like a shredded cedar mulch. You don't want to use chips or pine bark because they float, and your big rain event will come and your mulch will float down the street, and that's not helping anybody. So a shredded mulch is going to kind of mat together, bind together, and really help hold the soil. And, lastly, I would say I would encourage you to really utilize signage. This is a great opportunity to talk to people about what you're doing. You might be making a subtle change to your boulevard where you're just lowering the grade or removing some of the soil, and don't miss that opportunity to talk to people about kind of the point behind it, the ecological benefit of having that runoff go into a planted area instead of into the storm drain. It's a great opportunity, and there's lots of great signage available for you to be able to put it out there. It's also in a really public space, so people are really interested. We all spend a lot more time outside now going for walks, and it's a great chance for people to start to see, oh, this is a rain garden, this is capturing water, and they really understand the intention behind all the hard work that you've been doing. And finally, I would like to put a little plug in for our educational sessions. So one of the things that Blue Thumb does is coordinate a big workshop season. It's just getting ready to start. You're welcome to visit bluethumb.org to talk more, or excuse me, to find out more about our Resilient Yards workshops. We delve into lots of Resilient Yards practices in these workshops. They talk about adding diversity to your plantings, the value of trees and shrubs. We touch on boulevard rain gardens in general, and it gives you a lot of great resources. So if this is something you're interested in and you want to kind of go a little further, you can check out bluethumb.org, or if you're really tech savvy, you can use your phone to scan the QR code here. And that's also in the handout that we'll be sending to you. And I really appreciate you all having me here tonight. It's been a pleasure talking to you about boulevards. I hope on kind of our cold, snowy days, this is a great way to spark your interest in possible spring projects that you can do this year, and that you're going to start thinking about your boulevards in a new way when you start planning your gardening projects for this coming year.
Great, thank you very much. We have questions.
Okay, I hope I left some time, so that's good.
You did. So the first question, which several people, including myself, were kind of wondering about, in regards to dense planting.
Yeah.
Do you still follow the spacing needs for the plant? Do we ignore the spacing recommendations? What do we do, and how much can we cut it by?
Yeah, those are great questions. And this is something that we are exploring even more and more as we continually learn about ways to establish plant communities in a way that makes gardens less maintenance. I'll get to answering that, but one thing I'll say is that nobody ever asks me for a high maintenance garden. The common thing is they really want a low maintenance garden, and how can I help them create that? And it takes a little while to convince people that one of the ways that you can do that is to not have to weed as much or reapply as much mulch. And so a way to start that is to really start with a dense planting. And not just one that is, if you think about something like milkweed that's very leggy, planting a bunch of milkweed really close together kind of neglects the soil level, or like right at the ground cover level of the soil. And so our dense plantings are meant to have a variety of plants that are both going to be ground covers and then be a little taller. These aren't really tall plants because of that boulevard ordinance that restricts height in boulevards. And so we tend to plant at somewhere between 12 and 15 inches on center in boulevards. We're planting plugs or 4-inch pots, but we are cheating a little bit. It's not quite the right word, but we are planting them closer together than what may be the typical recommendation for something like a milkweed or a grama, where you might think of an 18-inch planting on center. We're getting a little closer. We're going anywhere between 12 and 15 inches on center.
Okay. And when you do have the denser planting, do you end up with more, for example, is it downy mildew? Powdery mildew. Powdery mildew is the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah, that hasn't been an issue, and mostly it's because of plant selection. And so in this case, we've got a lot of the primary kind of plant that forms the matrix of these plantings is really a grass or a sedge, and they don't tend to have that issue. You can get that on our bee balms. We do have a couple of bee balms in our plant palettes, but we have not had that to be a big problem. And it could be too that it's a planting that is primarily a matrix of a grass or sedge, and then the forbs and the flowers are poking up through that. And so we're really kind of focused on that ground cover sedge layer to start.
Okay. Do you recommend the double shredded mulch for all garden beds, and where do you find double shredded?
Yeah, I mean, we use double shredded fairly exclusively. I think it's a nice look to it. It started to have some, it started to kind of break down a bit because it's shredded. It's not in big chunks. Partly for aesthetic reasons, I don't really like chipped mulch. I think that I want something that's going to look a little bit more like soil, and a shredded mulch kind of has that look. There's a lot of places that you can find that. So at most kind of large mulch suppliers, they're going to have some form of shredded mulch. That's very common to find. If they have a double shredded, great. It just means it's shredded to a little bit of a finer, it's not like big chunks. It can be shredded a little bit finer. And then cedar mulch is usually shredded as well. That tends to be the most expensive mulch. So shredded cedar mulch is also a great way to start. It just smells really good. And if you're willing to invest in that, I mean, it's beautiful. But the one thing that I want to make sure that everyone realizes, the one thing we don't promote is the need to remulch year after year after year. That's maintenance. That's one of the high maintenance issues if you have to kind of start to really reapply mulch. And just mulch is not providing an ecological service within our landscapes that native plants or ground covers would provide. And so that's why we want that dense planting, so that eventually you really aren't needing to reapply a lot of mulch.
Speaking of mulch, the
Okay.
constant question of the past year, what about jumping worms in the mulch? Are you worried about it at all?
Sure, I'm always worried about jumping worms. Yeah, jumping worms have really thrown everyone for a loop. So one of the things that we do is that we, and I don't have all the answers on jumping worms by any means. We are really trying to keep up on any current publications about jumping worms, but it's certainly something I get concerned about. We purchase our mulch in bulk. So since we're a landscaping company, that's what we do. And we work really closely with our suppliers to ensure that they're monitoring for jumping worms. And it's something that they heat their mulch to make sure that they could be killing the eggs. And we also inspect the mulch before we apply it as well. And we have a couple of just really reputable sources and we stick to them. So but it's a challenge that unfortunately I don't have a great answer for. One other thing that I will say that can be recommended and can really be used in place of mulch if you just are avoiding purchasing mulch at all right now is if you have, leaves that are falling into your yard and you mow them each fall, use those as mulch. I mean, jumping worms like leaves, but they're not necessarily going to be found in the leaves that are falling from the trees in your yard. So that's one way of kind of like eliminating bringing additional things into your yard if you're concerned about kind of bringing mulch into your space. And that can serve just as great a purpose as shredded mulch if you don't want to purchase any mulch.
Okay. How do you manage weeds around trees in a boulevard when you're protecting the trees?
Yeah, it's great. I'd love to talk more about trees because trees are always in boulevards. So I'll take just a moment to do that. when you have a tree in a boulevard, they tend to be mounded or higher than the boulevard. Sometimes they're causing the mounted boulevard, and that's okay. And that's one of the things that I really want to make sure everybody knows is that a tree is really, really valuable. So we're putting in these boulevard rain gardens in areas where there aren't trees, because we don't want to harm an existing tree by digging around in its established root system. But trees don't necessarily like to grow in just lawn or turf. So it's actually really beneficial if you can transition from if you have a long boulevard and you have an area that does not have an existing root system, where you are able to establish a boulevard rain garden, to really then let that soil come up to the level of the tree, and to actually just continue to plant around the tree, but not right up to the base. So you want to give that trunk, a couple of feet of space, and then really just plant some of the ground covers around the base of the tree. They can start to cover that soil so that you're not getting a ton of weeds there. But it's a nice transition, right? If you're going to put in a boulevard rain garden, you then don't really want to have to mow the turf around the tree, because that just seems like one extra thing to do. So we recommend really transitioning the whole boulevard, but using ground covers around the base of the tree. Another reason to do that is if you really think about the life cycle of our pollinators and insects that live in the trees, they need to be able to fall on something that doesn't get mowed. And so if you can create a planting underneath your trees that allows the larvae of pollinators to fall to the ground in a space where they can then be in a protected ground cover, that's even more of a benefit for pollinators than having turf below trees. So I would say hand pull your weeds underneath your trees, and then try and establish kind of a ground cover that's going to cover that soil and help outcompete the weeds in that area.
Do you have a list of suggestions on what to do with the excavated dirt and the sod?
Yeah, that's the biggest challenge.
Ideas,
for
please.
Sure. Yeah, it really depends on how much space you have and whether that's something you can utilize in other parts of your property. You can always take sod and turn it over. So kind of flip it upside down, break it up, and use it to help create, if you're looking to create berms in your property. Sometimes, one of the things that I find when I do consultations at houses is that, especially if we have an older house, over time, the soil around the base of the house has really subsided. I have, friends who just recently, with this recent rain event, because of our frozen soils and because of grading, got water into their basement. So anytime you can use soil to reestablish positive drainage around your house, that's to a great advantage to you to help keep your basements dry. And so a lot of times we will actually use that soil, if as much of it as we can, around the base of a house. It really depends on whether there's a sidewalk or existing plantings. But if we can, we'll use it to help create positive drainage so that you no longer have a situation where water is flowing towards your basement. That's a great use for that extra soil.
Okay, we have a two-part question from Lee, who starts out with, tip for a proper hellscape. I'm on a 5-lane road in Coon Rapids that has full sun and tons of salt. Related, how would I handle a city that comes through a few times a winter to remove the boulevard snow by scraping it down to the dirt?
Oh, well.
So apart from sympathy.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I that can be a really challenging situation. I think a lot of our cities are becoming a lot more open to how we use our boulevards. So I wouldn't say trying to, I mean, of course, if you go out there and plant a lot and then they just come scrape it, you don't want to, waste your well-earned dollars on that. And I would say maybe reach out to the city and start kind of talking to them about how you could treat your boulevard differently, having a conversation with them about runoff. I mean, all of the cities, this is an important part of their stormwater infrastructure. And I think we're really starting to learn more and more about ways that we can utilize boulevards. Just here in Minneapolis, there was a street recently that was reconstructed, and they actually installed pre-treatment structure so that water from the road can come into the boulevard, into a lowered boulevard rain garden, and be infiltrated instead of going right down to the storm drain. And so our cities are really starting to implement some of these practices. It takes a little bit of time, and it's important for the city to understand that, it can be maintained, and you know what you're working on. But I think just even starting a conversation in that case would be a great way to kind of begin, talking about rain gardens and boulevards and how they can be valuable green infrastructure.
Okay.
I don't have a miracle plant, I'm sorry, to recommend for that situation, but I really do love Pearly Everlasting. I think it's just done really well in a lot of the boulevards we've planted.
I was to say I had some in my front yard, which is basically becomes a desert, and it was great.
Yeah, it really is. It can really.
It's fine with a lack of water. So
yeah, and it can spread,
if it
and
happens.
I like the way that I think some people have a kind of fear of putting in plants that are too aggressive, but in boulevards, we almost want to put in aggressive plants because we want them to make it. We know it's a challenging growing environment, and we want to put in the plants that we know are going to be tough and that are going to be able to handle these challenges. So don't shy away from that too much.
I'm going to ask people to make sure if you have any questions, we're coming up on the end here. We have a whole bunch. We're going to try and get through them all. But just if you haven't asked yet, you better ask soon. Did you consider foot traffic when you're deciding what plants to use? And what are some that will withstand people getting in and out of their cars onto them?
Yeah, one thing that we have done in a lot of the boulevards, and actually I would recommend this, is that we have a few areas where we have stepping stones across the boulevard and we don't put in plantings. We want people to have kind of a designated spot to be able to cross the boulevard, and that's one way to do that. So, create a path, make space for people to walk right through the boulevard. That's, I would say, the first choice. Second choice is one of my favorite plant palettes, and I didn't put it up in this presentation because it's maybe less exciting, but you saw it in one of the earlier slides, are wild strawberries. And so wild strawberries can take quite a bit of foot traffic. And we have done many boulevards, and it was on that very first slide where we planted, or we showed pictures of the boulevard profiles, and wild or woodland strawberries, so Fragaria virginiana, is just fantastic. And it really covers the ground. It's actually what I have in my own boulevard, and I walk on it all, my kids walk on it all the time when they're trying to get into their car. And that's a species that I would really recommend for a situation where you're going to have a lot of people walking across it. You can eat the berries if you get to them, or you can just leave them for the critters as well. So,
should the plants be cut back? And if so, in fall or in spring?
Yeah, so we cut back plants in spring. So I like to leave plants up all winter. They provide a valuable nesting habitat for pollinators, and we cut them back in the spring. A good kind of clue as to when to cut them back would be when the dandelions start blooming, and that's when you know that soil temperatures are about 50 degrees and they're about warm enough for pollinators to have emerged, and then you can feel comfortable cutting your plants. That's, for us, that's not what we do just in boulevards. We do that kind of in general within our landscapes, is recommend cutting back in the spring after pollinators have emerged. If you have plants with hollow stems, where you know that you would be, great plants for our native stem nesting pollinators, and we actually leave those we don't cut them down to the ground, we cut them down to 12 to 18 inches, so we're leaving a big section of hollow stem for ground nesting pollinators. Or stem nesting pollinators, excuse me.
Can you comment on maintenance once the boulevard garden is established?
Yeah, is the question kind of really what type of maintenance is there once it's established?
That I read you the.
I think so.
Yeah, just in general, are there specific things you need to do in certain years? Are there certain times when you should check to make sure that you don't need to replace something?
Yeah, so ideally it gets less and less maintenance as it goes on. So as your planting develops, the first year is always highest maintenance because you're needing to make sure that, especially if it doesn't rain, that you're providing that supplemental watering deeply, less frequently, but deeply, so that it's getting deeper into the soil. If you do see those weeds start to pop up, you're getting them when they're small, so you're not really giving them a chance to get established. And then over time, as your boulevard planting matures, you're going to need to spend less and less time on it. So those plants, once they fill in, really your biggest maintenance is that spring cutting back of the plants that I just mentioned. Other than that, they should need, really shouldn't need supplemental water unless we have an extreme drought and you can see that they're suffering. If you see, you know, we're a lot of gardeners here, I'm sure. And just like anything, we can control our gardens only so much. There are some plants that find their way, you know, they kind of really find their place in their garden. And so your garden, if you might find that one or two of those species really are happy and they're really enjoying it. And that's great. If you want to, over time, you know, add additional flowers, you can certainly do that. But, you know, the goal is that we're maintaining it less and less over time. There's enough to do than maintain a boulevard garden. So once you get it established, you're really having to spend less time on maintenance.
Okay. What do you recommend for edging between my boulevard garden and my neighbor's turf grass? Do I need to worry about plants spreading or erosion or the turf grass spreading?
Yeah, that's a great question, and where you kind of interact with your neighbor's boulevards. And we do recommend edging anytime you have where a mulched planting hits a lawn or something like that. Really what's more likely to happen is that the lawn is more likely to creep into the planted area. And so in that case, I would recommend edging. I mean, you can put in something like a metal or a plastic edging, but I really like just a narrow stone edging. So there's stone edging blocks that you can purchase. And the nice thing about those is that they can really you can use them to, if the slope is different from your boulevard to your neighbors, to kind of make up that change in grade. And so something like a Chilton stone edging, and you only end up needing, you know, 2 or 3 blocks, I think is really great for that situation. And yes, that's a great question. I would recommend edging in that situation.
My boulevard is on a Hennepin County road. What sort of search words should I use to search the county ordinance for boulevard gardening rules?
That's a good question, but I'm pretty sure that it would likely fall under the city. Well, I guess my question is, so within Minneapolis, there are county roads within the city. Depends on if you are just in the county or if it's a county road within the city. If it's a county road within a municipality, then you would, I believe, go by the municipality's ordinances.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. If that is not the case, please write back and tell us, and we'll figure it out from there.
Yeah.
We have a whole bunch of specific plant questions.
Okay.
How do you choose plants that are safe for dogs and cats? And how do you find plants that are resistant to both dog urine and salt?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that none of the, well, I guess it depends on how much your pets eat plants. There are a lot of plant lists out there, of course, that you can search to see what plants are, you know, going to be harmful for dogs and cats. I can say that in our plant palette, I have not checked that to see if that is any particular plant in there is going to be harmful for dogs or cats. So would need to do a little bit of research on that. Dog urine and dog waste is always an issue in boulevards, and that's kind of why we have selected the plants that we have. We've been installing boulevard gardens for a while, and we've even updated our plant palettes from when we started in 2019 based on what we found to be successful. It's always going to be an issue in a boulevard, and that's why we kind of have those particular palettes. One thing I would say is while you're getting your boulevard established, I have a couple of clients, and one thing they really like to do is put up just something that kind of lets people know, like a little metal decorative little fence pieces or something that just kind of tells people, hey, you know, I'm working on something here, give it a little bit of space. Or they put up a sign that says, you know, please don't let your, you know, dog use this area. And so that's a good way, kind of clue for people, but that's always going to be in the case in the boulevards. And that's kind of why we've picked some of those plants that we chose earlier, because they're the toughest of the tough.
We have about half a dozen questions left, but it is 7:30. Are you okay with sticking around for a little bit?
Yeah, I probably have about 5 minutes.
Okay, well, I'll read faster. You mentioned we should remove about 3 inches of soil.
Mhm.
You also mentioned that it's very compacted. Do you recommend replacing any of the existing soil with compost or something else to improve soil conditions?
That I would say is very site specific. So take a good look at your soil. I think a lot of people really feel like soils in those areas do need compost, and I think that's a great idea. I don't think you need to over compost it. So I think if you can remove 3 inches of soil and then add, a half an inch of compost, that's great. You want to just still make sure that no matter what, once you add some compost and you add some mulch, that you're not back up above the level of the sidewalk, especially in key areas where you really want, where you know that the water is coming across the sidewalk and you want to get it into the boulevards. You want to make sure that at the end of all this process, you don't have another mound in your boulevard, and you don't want to apply so much compost and mulch that that happens. And so sometimes it's kind of like targeted areas where you may want to excavate a little bit more to make sure that water can get into your boulevard. So I would say some compost is valuable. It really depends on the soil in your boulevard. And, do some digging in that. See if it's really sandy or if it's really clayey and you feel like it needs that organic matter to be able to, help get healthy soil for those plants to establish.
Um, with an existing tree in the boulevard, what's the smallest size rain garden, square feet wise, I could have while still not bothering the tree?
Well, the key there is that you really don't want to be digging within the drip line of the tree, and you really don't want to cut any roots that are larger than your wrist. That's a great example of where to stop. So tree roots are going to spread pretty far, and if you come and encounter some that are bigger than your wrist, you want to leave those alone. It's not so much that, you can have a rain garden that's 5 by 5 and 25 square feet, and that'll still capture runoff. I think the key is just making sure that you're not putting it in a space where it's going to impact your tree, or not putting it right at the trunk of the tree.
Okay. Again, hill strip with a tree at each end. I know I can't dig, but could I dig a 2 to 4 inch wide and deep trough at the sidewalk edge to help with the catch the water?
Yeah,
Would
you
that
can.
help?
Yeah, yep, you certainly can. And one of the things that you can do is if you have, a tree at each end and you know that their canopy touches and you're going to encounter all these roots, you could just remove the sod if there's turf there, if that's the case, and plant it. So then you're at least providing some additional habitat. And then one of the things you certainly can do is right where that sidewalk meets the boulevard, dig down there so that the water can get off the sidewalk into the boulevard, even if you can't create a whole rain garden. That can still make a really big difference.
What's the best hardscaping to use on a boulevard?
Oh, for like a carriage walk or something like that?
I guess.
Um,
Or like you were saying, the stepping stones.
yeah, stepping stones are great. It really depends on how, that's a bit of a departure from rain garden, so it depends on how you want to use that space. If you're going to put in a rain garden, do stepping stones, because you can kind of, they can be lower than the level of the surrounding sidewalk and curb. Any other hardscapes are gonna, not allow you to have an infiltrating boulevard.
Can you use shredded leaves for the
Yeah,
mulch?
yeah, that
Okay.
gets back to what I was saying earlier. If you really don't want to bring mulch into your yard, or if you just simply have a bunch of shredded leaves and you prefer to use that to mulch, you certainly can. Shred them as much as you can. The thing is they might float some, especially if you're kind of like, you water the plants, right after you plant them. It tends to help those leaves kind of mat down a little bit, and that's what you
Mhm.
want, is to have them kind of come together and mat down a little bit so that they're not gonna float away if you have a 2-inch rain, a week after you plant that boulevard.
Okay, last two questions. Should the
Yeah,
bee lawn palette be mowed and how often?
that is totally personal preference. So you can mow it if you want to, but you don't have to, and that is an aesthetic preference.
Okay. And are any of the suggested plants deer resistant?
Yeah, I think quite a few of them are deer resistant. So we've got our milkweeds in there. We have, I feel like I need to look back at those pallets. But yeah, I think quite a few of those, especially in that sunny, dry palette, are fairly deer resistant.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Jen.